I'm here to do a quick video on chapter 9 and chapter 7 of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. This particular video will cover chapter 7 and then I'll load another video that covers chapter 9. Who am I? I'm Karen Thomas Brown and I'm a professor of education in the College of Education, Health and Human Services. My research area is predominantly in immigration studies, focused on diversity and inclusion and how does this impact immigrants. I also focus a lot on how different policies, racist policies and racist immigration policies actually impact the experiences of immigrants in the US. Because I'm in the College of Ed, I also do a lot of educational based research around social justice. So what you're seeing on your screen right now are just some shots of Ibram Kendi's book cover and some excerpts. And throughout this video, that's what I use to sort of explain the various positions that I take. So you'll see where he talks about his overall definition for who a racist is and who an anti-racist is. He also has a definition, and I'll just point to it for you, about who an assimilationist is and who's an anti-racist over there. So these are quotes that come directly from the text. So please feel free to go ahead and read it. If this PowerPoint is also available to you, the links in it are clickable. So you can go in after you watch the video and you can click on those links to learn a little bit more about the topic. So Kendi starts out chapter 7 by talking about the notion of ethnic racism. He uses the example of how he teased his friend Kwame. And so what I've done here is ask the question, what is ethnic racism? How does ethnic racism divert attention away from policies and towards group behavior? How were the jokes that Kendi made about his childhood peer Kwame examples of ethnic racism? So as you read through this chapter, these are some of the questions I want you to focus on. In chapter 7, Kendi talks about what does culture mean. So cultural racist is one who is creating a cultural standard and imposing a cultural hierarchy among racial groups. So obviously the anti-racist to that is somebody who rejects these cultural standards and believe that cultures are equal. And then he goes on to talk a lot about what cultural racism is and where does it come from. And so there are some questions that I want you to focus on as well. And it is, how does cultural racism impact the perception and acceptance of Ebonics and non-standard white languages? And how does the creation of cultural standards lead to the rejection of cultural differences? And how can you practice seeing all cultures as equal? Because we're only here because some of us feel like there are cultures that are superior and not. And so I particularly like how Kendi was able to use somewhat of an autobiographical approach where he talks about his experience with Black culture and then he infuses it into the chapter from a theoretical standpoint to explain what Black culture is. And so let's jump into that really quickly. Culture, as I've defined it when reading this text, is a sum total of those traditions and practices and behaviors that influences a group. It's important to bear in mind that a group having culture doesn't mean that everyone in the race ascribe to that particular culture. And so I pulled this quote from Kendi's book just to sort of reinforce that idea, but also to point to where cultural racism originated. And so Kendi tracks it back to the impact of the Holocaust. So once the impact of the Holocaust, which was based on biological racism, was discounted, then cultural racism became the thing. He makes this very powerful statement where he says that whoever creates the cultural standards put themselves on top. And so suddenly what we're seeing is cultural standards that say white is the norm, white is the foundational culture, and whatever else we see, especially in African American communities, is just a derivative or an attempt to adjust to this culture, which is an assimilationist approach, because what it's saying there is that Black culture is not good enough unless we infuse white culture, and we're just trying to adopt what white culture has. Which then jumps over to the idea of what then is Black culture. So when we hear of the term Black culture, there's a bunch of things that pop in our head. We immediately think urban culture. We think hip hop culture. We think culture of non urban Blacks. We think Black Southerners, the notion of go go music. And we think language, Ubonics, what a lot of racist approach view as non standard or broken English, which is not the case, by the way. And Ibram makes a very strong case for why Ubonics should not be seen as broken or non-standard English. When we look at the chapter, he celebrates Black music and urban culture, and he uses certain phrases that I found very, very uplifting. So he says it uses a sophisticated vocabulary, it's poetic in nature. They're autobiographies. So you listen to one of the songs, and if you truly listen to the words and the lyrics, what you find is that it's telling a whole story. So it's storytelling. And remember, storytelling is a part of our African heritage. That was how a lot of our traditions got passed from one generation to the next. It's about dreams and hopes and aspirations. It's also a form of urban reporting. And what he didn't say, but I want to add, it's also a form of protest. So it's a way of saying, this is my life, don't destroy it. And it's also sexual boasting. So I pulled this quote where he says, but the dominant culture sees it as deviant, thuggish, a hindrance to assimilation and uncivilized. And a lot of times when Black culture pops up, those are some of the phrases and terms and characterization that we see. And he says this is inherently racist. Now I've pulled two quotes here from the text related to language. And in 1973, he points to the psychologist that says that it's racist to refer to African American language as broken or non-standard English. And he goes further to ask the question, if it's broken English, why is it that English itself is not considered broken? Especially given the fact that English is a derivative of Latin, and so it could be seen as broken, as a broken language. So if we're not willing to say English is broken Latin, then it is inherently racist to say that Ebonics is broken English. And the same thing goes for other versions of language that have evolved in the Western Hemisphere from people who have been enslaved. I'm from Jamaica and we speak Patois. And Patois is a combination of English, French, and Afrikaner. And it's a sophisticated language. It's a colorful language. It's a musical language developed by enslaved people as a way of communicating with each other during slavery that has evolved into this accent that you hear right now. And for us on the island, as a part of this racist system, we were not allowed to speak Patois in school. In school, we learned English, we wrote, write, and spoke English. But the moment school was out and we stepped through those gates, we went right back to our home language, our core language, which was Patois. And that's what African Americans are saying. This is a part of our identity. And so to refer to it as non-standard and broken is racist because it is marginalizing it. It's diminishing the value of this language. Kendi then went on to look at culture from a religious perspective. And he talks about the racist perspective of saying, number one, in the South, there is no African culture, which implies that African culture is static and it never changed after the enslaved people were taken to the New World. But he argues the case that culture evolves, culture change with space and time and geography. And therefore, what we see as manifestation of religion in America and in Central America and South America and in the Caribbean are enslaved people who have taken Christianity and infused their African heritage. And so I pulled this quote because I thought it was really indicative of what we're talking about. He talks about walking into an African church or a black church and see strangers embrace each other as brother and sister. And this is not just in America, this is in almost all black cultures. We refer to each other as brother and sister. We get into what we refer to as the Holy Ghost, where women get into the spirit. We talk about that. It's almost like a pep rally. But what's important is that we celebrate. It's always a celebration. He mentioned right here the funeral is livelier. I'll give you an example. In Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, we refer to it as the ninth night, where we have a celebration for 9 days after somebody dies. And then at the funeral, it's less mournful and more celebratory because we believe that that person has moved on to somewhere better, to a better place. And so, and it comes from the Swahili version of Nakumboka, meaning that we celebrate, we do incantations, and we pass that spirit on. And so that has been brought into our religious practices. And so to say that it is not uniquely African is to say that African culture is static and lacks the capacity to evolve. If you go to somewhere like Haiti, you see voodoo practices, which is infused, which is African practices infused into Christianity. If you go to Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, you see Obia or revivalism, again, African practices infused. And so he makes a very strong case for why it is a part of African American culture and should be celebrated rather than seen as not quite American or Christianity. Next, he talks about the notion of a cultural home. He says nothing compares to arriving on the Ave. And within the Ave, there's so many cultural products that he talks about. He talks about the cab ride. And it brought me back to my days living in Jamaica of the experience in the $50 taxi, as we would call them, where you hopped into a taxi, there was maybe 5 or 6 of you jammed packed like a sardine. But the moment that taxi pulled away from the stand, you became a cohesive group. You shared stories, you talked, you got to know each other, and you were a group. And then once that taxi arrived at your stop, you exited and you also exited that group, and you're no longer part of that group. And tomorrow you got up, you got into another taxi, and it was another experience, and you never saw these people again. And so he talks about how inherently black culture is group culture. Inherently we call each other brother and sister, and we see each other as a part of who we are. But he also talks about the cultural products on the avenue in terms of our fashion, in terms of our jewelry, in terms of the tattoos that people wear, the freshness with which we addressed and saw ourselves, and how those on the outside saw this as thuggish and uncivilized, but how we saw it as a way of binding us. And so he talks about the importance of that. And so here I have a picture of 2 of our iconic hip hop artists who have passed. And so we have Biggie Smalls, and of course we have our Tupac. But just the images that are portrayed of them in terms of the jewelry and the fashion and the tattoos is often seen by society as deviant. But yet it is also appropriated by white culture. And when it's appropriated, it suddenly becomes great and fantastic, and look at us. And the example that comes to mind for me is the hoop earring. When a black or Latina girl wears the hoop earring, she's ghetto and hood. But when a white person puts on a hoop earring, she becomes classic. Because look at this classical style. And we can think of so many other examples of cultural appropriation that have made their way into mainstream society, but when used or exhibited by people of color within black spheres, it is demeaned. And so Kendi closes this chapter by saying what we should focus on is Black lives. And he talks about how he equates the treatment of his racist white teachers to the treatment of police who were white, who were heaping physical pain. The pain he saw from his racist white teachers was psychological pain that then led to certain lifestyles that would have resulted in the police inflicting physical pain and death on Black bodies, and how others viewed, other white people that is, viewed Black people almost as if they were subhuman. And he says when we talk about culture, and we talk about culture in an anti-racist approach, we should see difference. That's it. It's just simply different. It is not right or wrong. It's not better or worst. It's not superior or inferior. And it's not standard and imitation. It is simply different. He says we must move beyond our cultural racist conceit and behaviorally racist insecurities and simply see difference.